Hello and welcome to a special episode of Palace Confidential following the funeral of Queen Elizabeth II. Here to discuss it today is the Daily Mail's consultant editor Andrew Pearce, alongside the paper's diary editor Richard Eden. Welcome to you both. Andrew, I'm going to start with you. An extraordinary service, one certainly nothing like I've ever seen in my lifetime, and one the Queen would have wanted.
She would have chosen every hymn, every prayer, probably every speaker. There were probably more speakers than I expected. It was unfussy, deeply religious, which is her to a T, and I found parts of it incredibly moving. And when they struck up "God Save the King" at the end, that's when I lost it, because I'm thinking, until a few days ago, it was "God Save the Queen." But, and Charles was clearly struggling with his own emotions, and I think the Wessexes were too, in particular. I thought it was extraordinary, an extraordinary service at the end of an extraordinary 8 or 9 days.
Would you really describe it as unfussy? What do you mean by that? Because it was such a spectacle.
Well, I'd say unfussy in the sense, if you think back to Princess Diana's funeral, we had
Elton.
Elton, and a famous opera singer, and a soprano, soloists. I would have called that quite a fussy service, and also in the congregation, loads of people from the world of show business. So that's what I mean by unfussy, the sort of the trimmings around it. The actual service itself was deeply, deeply moving and powerful.
Richard, an extraordinary turnout. Do you think it's a reflection of her standing in the world? So many world leaders there.
It was amazing, and just seeing them all arriving in these coaches, you know,
the minibuses, we've discussed that. Yeah,
it's fascinating. And the thing that really struck me was, you know, their position. So you'd have Joe Biden, the leader of the free world, but not in the most prominent position at all. That really was reserved for the royal families, the foreign royal families who were seated directly opposite our royal family, because that's what it was. You know, it's a family funeral as well as a state funeral, and they would have more precedence, they'd have a more prominent role than the various heads of state. But, I mean, imagine how complicated it was to arrange that placement for everyone.
Do you think that there would have been a lot of jockeying for position, or do you think people just would sit where they're told?
I think generally they'd have to accept it. People got there very early, and it was fascinating to see people arriving. And I think they had to accept that. It was the Queen's funeral. It was a measure of the respect in which she was held, that I don't think they'd be fussing about their own positions.
And we didn't, a lot of people I didn't recognise who were in some of the prominent positions. These were probably people who worked in the Queen's charities, organisations she was very fond of. Again, if you think back to, for instance, Harry and Meghan's wedding, I can still see Oprah Winfrey. She was virtually sitting in the Queen's lap.
Yes.
And we subsequently found out that Meghan hardly knew Oprah Winfrey. So the Queen would have chosen, I mean, presidents they may be, but in the presence of Her Majesty the Queen, she was the most powerful, important figure on the planet in terms of who people know, and she would have ensured the pecking order was the right pecking order for her.
And you mentioned the emotions of some of the royal family. Normally we're used to seeing them so reserved in public, but Edward looked in pieces.
Yeah, he did. Really, really distressed. And his wife, Sophie, who we've read a lot about in the Mail, the other daughter, if you like, referred to the Queen as Mama, she was really struggling too. But Prince Edward, he'd lost his mum. And he's devastated, and he saw a lot of her because they live very close to Windsor. Bagshot Park's only up the road, so they saw an awful lot of his mum in the last weeks and months of her life, and I think they probably became even closer.
And there's something about being the baby of the family, isn't there?
Yeah, and just the world watching while you're mourning. You know, we've all experienced mourning, being at funerals, and how tough it is, but knowing the eyes of the world are on you must be particularly hard.
So what did you think then of young Prince George and Princess Charlotte's role there today? I don't know if I was surprised to see them, but it's a big thing for such young children to be part of on a world stage, isn't it? Yeah,
it was really interesting, and a really interesting point to discuss, I think, because, you know, when's the right age to attend a funeral? I think I was a teenager when I attended my first one. And we haven't seen George or Charlotte or any of the children at all since the Queen's death. You might remember that the new Princess of Wales stayed at home to do the school run when the Queen was dying, because she felt that was important. It was literally their first full day of school. So we haven't seen them at all. So it was a big decision to invite them. But I think it was the right one, just because, you know, they're often aged, you know, George is, 9, Charlotte's 7, and it's something that they will treasure their whole lives, I think. Like, yes, it will have been a big experience and perhaps difficult at times.
Very long day.
Yeah.
Isn't it one of 3 services they're attending
A long
today?
day, but they're surrounded
Yeah.
by their loving family, and, you know, I think it shows the continuity of the royal
Yeah.
family.
Well,
it's a very important
I think
symbol.
It's
that's what
that
it was about.
real stark realisation, is it, that life and succession
Yeah.
rolls on.
Yeah, I mean, when the Queen is interred in Windsor Castle, the orbs taken away, the sceptre,
Yeah.
the crown, she goes into the ground as almost one of us, a mere mortal. And when you saw George and his little sister there, you realise that's the monarchy's moving on already.
Yeah.
It's already moved on. You've got the King, his heir, Prince William, the Prince of Wales, and then George. And I think it was right to have them there. I was 8 years older when I went to my grandmother's funeral, and I was at Roman Catholic. I was an altar boy on the altar, and I remember it being really difficult. But I remember being really strong and not crying, because I thought that's what she would want. And you looked at those children, and we know how affectionate they were to Gangan, and I thought they did very well.
Yeah, very well. Andrew, at the top of the service came the Commonwealth. That was important to the Queen, wasn't it?
Hugely, and she organised, before she departed, so many things, didn't she? And the thing she organised was that Prince Charles, the King, will take over from her as head of the Commonwealth. She let it be known that's what she wanted, and they complied. Baroness Scotland, who is effectively runs the Commonwealth Association, she did the first reading, very important, a black woman, and Prince Charles, King Charles, is utterly committed to the Commonwealth too. And there was a big representation of the Commonwealth in that congregation.
There was. It really fascinated me. I immediately recognised those Aussie uniforms, even though I haven't seen them in person for a very long time. But all of these royal events, Richard, let's move on to the seating plan, which usually speaks volumes. I know you've got some thoughts on that.
I think seating plans for the royal family really are important. You might remember at the Platinum Jubilee service at St Paul's Cathedral, you know, we had a whole programme discussing that, and that caused a lot of controversy because of Harry and Meghan. They were relegated to the second row behind, you know, sort of much more junior royals in the sort of the Queen's cousins, but that's because they weren't working royals. And we saw that again, and they were stuck on the second row, whereas other members of the royal family, indeed like Zara Tyndall and her brother Peter Phillips, and Mike Tyndall, Zara's husband, they were on the front row. And I think that's an age thing, apparently, that because they're older than Harry, they get precedence.
Oh, really?
I'm not sure, is the honest truth. But either way, Harry and Meghan were there on the second row.
They couldn't have expected to be in the front row, surely. And they, well, I don't know if they were upset not to be at the reception at Buckingham Palace last night, but again, they've walked away from the royal family, so they can't possibly expect they can do a bit of pick and mix here and put one foot in and one foot out when it suits them. It doesn't work like that.
Yeah, and
they've
then,
opted to pull out.
Well, at least they were there, I think. But
Yeah.
Sophie Wessex on the front row, she seems to be really being moved into pole position in a lot of ways.
I think so, and I hope so, and I hope we'll see and hear a lot more about her.
Richard, some Meghan watchers might have been disappointed, and I noticed you pointed out something on Twitter about that.
Well, there I was watching the coverage, you know, on television, and you couldn't see Meghan. Why was
shame.
that?
How
It was
terrible.
because there was this,
Andrew.
How terrible.
there was this really cool, really tall candle right in front of the view of the camera. And not just that, but by coincidence, they seem to have been seated, Harry and Meghan, directly behind the tallest member of the royal family. That's Tim Lawrence, Princess Anne's husband. Now, you know, that could be coincidence, or but as we know, everything is planned meticulously.
The Queen was a master diplomat.
You two are so naughty.
The Queen could have written the textbook on diplomacy. Very skilled, and she would have worked out every single detail, and she'd have thought about it from every single perspective. And she knows that Abbey very, very well, and she knows where the candles are.
OK, so what about Sarah Ferguson then and her? She had quite a good seat, and surely speaks volumes about how her relationship was with the Queen up to the end.
It had improved a lot,
Yeah.
and of course, she's very important to Prince Andrew. They're no longer married, but they live under the same roof and have done for a long time. And I can remember when I interviewed Prince Andrew, for the Mail, these was in the days long before the shadow of Jeffrey Epstein had engulfed him. And he said very simply about Sarah Ferguson, she's the mother of my children. why wouldn't I have a good relationship with her? Why wouldn't I want to have a good working relationship with her and a good friendly relationship with her? He said, it's really important, and you saw that again today.
It really is remarkable, her rehabilitation, you know, from she was a pariah, you know, when she was on the front pages, she was banned from Balmoral by Prince Philip. She was never allowed to go there at the same time as him. But gradually, and certainly since Prince Philip's death, she's really been brought back into the fold by the Queen.
Well, then maybe in 20 years' time we'll be sitting here and you'll be saying that about Meghan.
Maybe, yeah.
Who? In 20 years' time?
If I had some pearls, Andrew, I would clutch them right now. Richard, we've covered all the developments in the ongoing debacle with the Prince Harry's uniform situation. What is the latest?
Well, viewers will have seen today that for the funeral he was in civvies, he was in regular morning dress like his uncle Prince Andrew. But what we saw on Saturday was the vigil of the grandchildren, where we don't know why particularly, but they'd come up with this idea of having a vigil by the Queen's coffin of all 8 of the grandchildren. And he was allowed to wear his uniform then of the Blues and Royals, given special dispensation by the King. And it was a very moving event, it really was. But it seems to have caused another row. We read in the papers the next day that Prince Harry had been desperately unhappy. Now, the reason for this, obviously he should have been thrilled that he was allowed to wear a uniform, but when this uniform arrived, it was delivered, and it didn't have the ER sort of epaulets on the shoulder that Prince William had. And people were saying, oh, you know, it's terrible, it was an example of him being badly treated. But what it was you only get these if you're an aide-de-camp of the Queen. And he lost that role. So others, like Prince Andrew or Prince William, still had that role up until the Queen's death, whereas Harry didn't. He lost that along with everything else.
It's fascinating to me, the detail of that, whereas, like, you know, if I was in charge of all of that, I might have missed that detail. But
how did it get into the public domain? Was it put into the public domain by a source close to Prince Harry? Indeed it was.
Right.
So carping and moaning 24 hours, 36 hours before the Queen's funeral, I thought was the wrong time. If he was unhappy about that, there was another time and place for it. And as Richard pointed out, there was a very good reason why, and if he just picked up the phone to someone, they could have explained it to him. But instead, it seems somebody picked up the phone to a friend, a source, I think we all probably know who that one is, and hence the story appears in the Sunday papers. Harry unhappy again.
So, Richard, as I mentioned earlier, this is one of 3 events connected with this funeral today. Can you tell us any more about what services are now to follow?
Yes, so we have another one which is also televised, which is the service at St George's Chapel, which is more of a family event. What we've seen at Westminster Abbey is the state event with, you know, representing the world. And then at St George's is a more intimate occasion. That's where Harry and Meghan got married, where we've seen other royal weddings. And then there's a third ceremony, which is not televised. It's the private one for the interment of the Queen.
That's a long day.
And she's going to be reunited with Prince Philip.
Yes.
And her parents, father and mother, and also the ashes of Princess Margaret. They'll all be in this separate chapel off of St George's Chapel, which is, again, her wish, and very moving, the whole family together again.
Incredibly. But then on the flip side, all this sort of ceremony and grief and mourning and ritual, the rest of the royals are going to have to hit the ground running. They've all got new roles. They've all got busy diaries. What can we expect over the next few weeks?
Well, I think we're going to see it pretty soon. The King and the Queen Consort will go down under, because the Australian Prime Minister has been very supportive, hasn't he? He'd have been there at the funeral today for sure, and he says no chance of a referendum anytime soon.
Wow.
Good. So I think there'll be a lot of. I think they may send the younger. The Prince and Princess of Wales may go to some of the overseas territories perhaps first, because they're younger, and the King is going to have a lot of work to do. And I suspect also he might need a bit of a rest, because this has been a gruelling pace.
I really hope he gets one.
He needs it. He needs it. And we mustn't forget the Queen Consort. She's broken a toe, and yet she's still, if you pardon the expression, put her best foot forward and has been out there with him morning, noon and night. She's been terrific.
I mean, what we've seen in today's service is the importance of the Commonwealth, so that will be reflected in their next itinerary.
Well, I'm wondering what you think today will it have an effect on any sort of swelling support for republicanism?
I guess they're going to lose a few countries, aren't they? Antigua may go, Barbuda, those sort of places. But I heard the New Zealand Prime Minister speaking on the radio, and she was sounding very pro continuation, and I don't think she's particularly a royalist at heart. And I did some work with Canadian television. They said, no way is there going to be any debate about the monarchy ending in Canada. There's a great outpouring of affection, and this has been wall to wall in Canada. It's been wall to wall in most countries, actually. It makes me terribly proud, actually, that half the world has tuned in to say farewell to our Queen.
I mean, there's a lot of goodwill towards King Charles, and hopefully that will be reflected around the world in the Commonwealth, and that will give him a good impetus to start and shore up the monarchy in those countries.
Wow. So, well, my parents will be very excited to see any of the royals there in Australia.
I wonder if they might send the Prince and Princess Wales.
Well, I did wonder about that.
They'd probably be more excited about that.
Probably. Sorry, King Charles. What are your views on British republicanism, though? Do you think that there's any chance of a sort of a support coming in for that?
We'll see. I think Republicans would have been very disappointed that there hasn't been already a sort of outpouring of resentment against the monarchy and a surge for them. I think that, as I say, it's created goodwill towards Prince Charles, and he needs to build on that. So it depends how he acts as monarch, and hopefully he won't put a foot wrong, and that will keep things secure.
I think it's been amazing to watch what's happened in the last 10 days. The establishment has just behaved like a steamroller. It's just steamrolled everything. He is the king, that's it. We've had an accession council, he's the king, she's queen consort. Who'd have thought 20 years ago Camilla could be called Queen anything?
Yeah.
Extraordinary. And I think the Republicans have been sent flying to all four corners of the realm. And it's interesting that they're going to sing the national anthem at the Labour Party conference, where you would expect to find more Republicans. Keir Starmer apparently is nervous that some people might boo. I should think he would be after what's happened in the last 10 days, because I think the monarchy, the polls will show the monarchy now even more popular than it was perhaps at the time of the Jubilee. And
looking ahead, when do you think we might see a date for a coronation?
I suspect that will be next summer. They like to do it when the weather's better, which here tends to be May or June.
No
when
guarantees,
you're more
yeah.
likely.
Yeah.
Perhaps they'll do it the same day as the Queen's coronation. I think that was June the 2nd, I think.
Yeah, there is talk of that. And also, we mustn't forget, nobody will forget, but we're in a terrible cost of living crisis, and coronations are not cheap to stage, and King Charles will be very mindful of that. So I think June could be the time, and I suspect it might be a more slimmed down affair perhaps than they were thinking of originally.
Yeah.
And what role will Meghan and Harry have, for instance, in it? Will they be, will they have a big role or not minor role?
Let's not talk about that just yet.
But because it may be that just Prince William and Princess of Wales have the big role, because they're the future.
It's going to be interesting. At least we had lovely weather today, right?
Yeah.
We will leave you today with some of the most moving images of today's events. My thanks to Andrew Pearce, Richard Eden, and to you, of course, for watching. We will see you again next Thursday on Palace Confidential. Bye-bye.